for. So we have Chris Mosher and, oh my gosh, Marty Allen Cummings is here to moderate. And let me just tell you a little bit about what you're here, and then I'm going to let these two brilliant, amazing human beings take over. So we're talking about building a legacy of trans inclusion in professional sports. So trans athlete and dual athlete Chris Mosher was the first trans person to compete in Olympic trials in the gender that he identifies with, and is sponsored by Nike. Also makes him the first trans athlete to land a sponsorship with a major sports company. Yeah, no big deal. So in this talk, we're going to hear about the implications that Chris experiences for trans athletes everywhere, and where we can, what we can do to push back against trans legislation, you know, wherever we live. And Chris might have some, hopefully, I'm sure we'll have some insights for us there. And just, you know, to highlight, you know, Chris has been dubbed the man who changed the Olympics, and I couldn't be a bigger fan and a bigger supporter, and just truly inspired by. Also inspired by Marty Allen Cummings, here to moderate. So grateful to have this human back. Marty is an activist, you know, run for city council. If I had been in your district, I would have voted for you, Marty, just saying. Marty is a performer, a drag performer. They've been around for decades, you know, has developed and deeply involved in the community. Helps, you know, young people through the Ali Forney Center and aiding New Yorkers experiencing homelessness. There's just so much I could go on, but I'm going to pass it over to you two. Thank you so much, Chris and Marty, for being here. I'll hand the ball to you.
Good morning. Good morning. How is everyone? Hi, Chris.
Hello. I like Hunter, strong sports reference there, passing the ball over to us. Appreciate that intro.
I am not athletic at all, so thank you for giving the sports reference for me. Chris, it's so exciting to be with you today. Welcome to the summit. I'm just so honored to be able to talk with you about trans youth and trans athletes. We're hearing a lot about this in the news right now, and I think it's a really important conversation to have. So I just want to start off, tell us a little bit about some of the milestones and in your career and your journey as a trans athlete.
Yeah, so I transitioned in 2010. I think that's a good starting point. You know, marking the fact that I was assigned female at birth, I was raised and socialized as female, and I grew up playing girls and women's sports. I was a 3-sport all-conference athlete in high school, had dreams of playing college basketball, and when the time came, decided not to for a variety of reasons. But looking back, I can say it was because I didn't feel comfortable on a girls' team, on a women's team. The thought of a coach saying, "Hey, ladies," or "Let's go, girls," made me cringe inside. And it's not because there's anything wrong with being a female athlete or being a woman in sports. I think women's sports are incredible. I'm a bigger fan and supporter now than I was then. But I think that's because I didn't want to be seen as a woman. And I didn't know that at the time. But when I finally understood my identity, I waited over 1.5 years to transition because I was terrified I'd lose my ability to play sports. At that time, I was just getting into triathlon. I won my first triathlon. And that was really the moment that I realized that I had to do something about my identity because I was too embarrassed to tell other people that I won because it was in the women's category. And that was really a turning point for me. So 2010, I switched categories and started to advocate for myself in sports, which really led me to being an activist now. 2015, I made Team USA for the first time. I had to challenge the International Olympic Committee policy on trans athletes to get my own participation to be verified. And that changed the rules for every trans athlete after me. 2020 went to the Olympic trials in race walking. That's a totally different session. I was like, what is the queerest sport that I could do in? And, you know, I've really spent the last decade of my life trying to make it easier for every transgender person in sports who comes after me.
That's amazing. Congratulations on Olympic trials. That's a huge deal. And as we heard, a Nike endorsement. Love that. That's so major and groundbreaking, and will help so many other trans athletes, not only with their ability to compete, but being seen and feeling validated in who they are. incredibly important. So thank you for that. So I want to ask, being given the right to compete by the Olympic Committee in these international sports, what do you think kind of moved the needle for the Olympic Committee to be able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, initially I contested the policy based on a surgery requirement. So the 2003 Stockholm Consensus from the International Olympic Committee was their policy on trans athletes prior to my challenge. And that required every transgender athlete to wait 2 years of taking hormone therapy and to have a full lower surgery, internal, external genital modification in order to play sports.
Wow.
And I really see that as a human rights violation. Like, no athlete should be forced to modify their body in order to participate in sports. So the result of that challenge was that they reduced the wait time from 2 years to 1 year for transgender women. They eliminated the hormone requirement completely for trans men, and they took away the surgery component of that policy. And so, for me, I think what really moved the needle for them, part of it was that I was a name and a face of an actual athlete who was impacted. I think that they made this policy without having consulted with transgender people themselves.
That often happens, right?
So often happens. And we're seeing it more and more today. And we can talk a little bit about what happened this weekend with policy. But the International Olympic Committee had set this, but from 2003 all the way up to 2015, there was no athlete who said, hey, this doesn't really make sense. And when I made Team USA and then couldn't participate based on the policy, I was really just advocating for my rights to be able to play, and then also for other athletes' rights. And honestly, I think it probably would have been a very different outcome had I been a trans woman or had I been a trans person of color, which is very sad to say, but it was very much, I think, my white male privilege that made me be not a threat in sports, because people largely assume that people assigned female at birth will never be as competitive as people assigned male at birth. And so for a lot of different reasons, I think they looked at me and thought, all right, like, what's the worst that can happen? Like, he competes, he's not going to win. He's not going to, disrupt our system too much. So that is the unfortunate reason why I think that I was able to get it to move.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of misogyny and transphobia all mixed into one. So, with that being said, you mentioned how it might be more difficult for a trans woman, or particularly, a trans person of color. So what is your kind of advice or guidance that you would give to other trans athletes who are looking to compete in sports? How can they advocate for themselves?
Yeah, the first thing would be to check if there's a policy already in place, and folks can find, I would say, nearly every policy that's out there is on my website, transathlete.com. And so that's a good starting point to see, does your sport have a policy? What is it? What does it say? What might we be fighting against? Or is there a clear pathway for you to participate? The second thing would be to surround yourself with community and to have a good support system, because the unfortunate reality of today's situation is that any transgender woman who wants to participate in sports, even if it's your local 5K, is being faced with a tremendous amount of pushback because of the way the media talks about us, and the way that sport policy has been written about us, and the way that state legislatures across the country are having conversations about us. So with all of the myths and misunderstandings about trans people, transgender women in sports are taking the brunt of that discrimination, unfortunately. So having a support system, whether it's other transgender athletes, I run a couple of support groups for trans athletes, communities where people can just share the experiences that they're having, or if it's a non-sports person, just a supportive partner or friend, somebody to help you through those hard times. I think those are two really important things.
Sure. Yeah, I always am a huge advocate for that chosen family. Surround yourself with people who can, lift you up, because it can really bog you down. And like you mentioned, you came out in 2010, and I feel like, for a while we were seeing trans rights happening, and now we're seeing them drastically rolled back and very quickly. Like you mentioned, like talking points in the media, the right is really, really honing in on very old talking points about queer people and especially trans people. And I love that you mentioned, you know, how legislative bodies are acting. You know, in this year, we're what, 6.5 months into the year, and we've already seen 200 plus pieces of anti-LGBT legislation, primarily targeting trans people. So I want to ask, you think it's gotten better or worse? But I think it's gotten worse.
Yeah, and you're right. So there was a swing, you know, like I'm not the first trans athlete. I'm not, you know, don't claim to be there, but there was a big gap between myself and Renee Richards in professional and elite sports. And so, you know, in that 40-year time period between having a cultural conversation around transgender people in sports, I think that, you know, from 2010 when I came out through 2017, there was a lot of progress that was made. When I made Team USA, when I got sponsored by Nike, that amount of visibility helped other people see themselves and possibilities for themselves in sport. But with that sort of visibility and the transgender tipping point, so to speak, of having Laverne Cox be celebrated in the media, having, you know, out people in all areas of life and more visibility, more understanding about our identities, there's that pushback that happened. And it really started in sports in about climbing up to 2020 when we saw the first anti-trans sports bill be passed into law, signed into law in Idaho. COVID-19 shut everything down. And when they came back in 2021, you know, over 300 pieces of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation, 150 of them targeting the trans community. This year, nearly 100 pieces of legislation targeting transgender people. And we have to remember that this is not, you know, this is not about sports. Like they're targeting trans kids in sports. And in state after state after state, we're seeing one trans kid, maybe 4 trans kids, with one of them being a trans girl, one trans kid on the field hockey team. Like that's it, right? It's not a huge influx of trans people in sports. It's a huge pushback against our visibility and our existence. And those sports bills have been paired with anti-trans bills that target our ability to access gender-affirming healthcare. Some of the bills target our ability to change our gender marker on our IDs to match who we are, to make it easier to navigate the world. And so we're really seeing that, you know, this isn't about sports. It's not even about medical care. It's about trying to make trans kids not grow up to be transgender adults. And, you know, it's trying to legislate trans people out of existence. And that might sound like a stretch, but if you look at the big picture here, it really is trying to make it so that we are so uncomfortable in daily life that we cease to exist, which we know will not happen. We know that trans people have been here since the beginning of time. We are not going away anytime soon. But the amount of pushback that's happened because of that progress that we made has really exponentially increased, probably honestly since the 2016 election, but certainly in the last 3 years. And we're really feeling the impact of that now as our country has become more divided. And the right has message tested this to see that trans rights and the existence of trans people is a real win for their voter base. And that's the unfortunate reality now, is that people are forgetting that we're talking about real humans here, right? Trans people are not a mythical creature. We're not like some idea in theory. We are actually living, breathing humans, some of whom are your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, your colleagues. And, you know, people are losing sight of that, and the fact that we're really targeting among all people, we're targeting children right now, which is really, really heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's so overwhelming. I feel like every day in the news there's something new about legislation. And like you mentioned, it's impacting our kids and affirming our kids, and now even going after, if you're a parent who supports your child, you can be reported to child services in some places. And, you know, I read a thing about a bill, I think it was in Florida, where they want to make it so you have to be 25 to start even consulting about you know, gender affirming care, which is not just impacting kids, that's now telling an adult you're legislating an adult's being. And it will, like, I believe, and I'm sure you feel this way, like these pieces of legislation will cost people lives. You know, we know that traditionally LGBTQIA plus youth have higher rates of suicide, and this is just going to exacerbate that issue. So having visible role models like yourself is, it's excuse me, it's needed. It's so important. So what are some of the we see these themes rising in legislators, like you said, it's a win for their voter base. And I sometimes get frustrated with, I don't know if we're allowed to be, if we have to be like nonpartisan in this, but anyway,
they didn't tell us beforehand, so let's just go.
So anyway, Republicans, terrible. But I get sometimes frustrated with the left, with Democrats. It's like, why are you not fighting harder for this? So what are some kind of things that you think we as people who aren't legislators can do to really engage with our legislators so trans people, especially our young trans people, are protected and taken care of?
Yeah, I mean, let's start with that, right? So this should not be a political topic. My identity is not political. It has been politicized for points, for leverage. And to be fair, I know great people who are voting Republicans, and I know horrible people who vote Democratic, and I know people on both sides who support me and some who do not, right? So trans rights shouldn't be political. It should be human rights, right? Trans rights are human rights, and we have to think about it in that perspective. With that said, it really has been people on the conservative leaning and far right people who have led the attacks on trans people. And that is worth mentioning because, we have to call it what it is, that the reason for that has been strictly in an election year to move voters to vote for them. And so one thing for any ally out there, any person who's not seated in government, is to think about the people that you're voting for and where they stand on these issues. And, this is part of the problem with so many things going on in our world right now, with gun control and bodily autonomy and voting rights and LGBTQ rights, that some people may vote based on their position on abortion, for example, and neglect all of the other topics that lawmaker is in favor of or against. And so it's really important to do your research on your candidates, and also to vote in your local elections, right? Because all of these pieces of legislation are not federal, they're state-led. And that is your state legislatures, your state governors, your state senators and representatives who are making those decisions. So we have to be involved politically in voting for people who support LGBTQ plus rights. The next thing would be to engage with those lawmakers as they're making this legislation. So on my website, transathlete.com, I have a whole page of action steps that people can take in any state that there's anti-trans legislation, who to contact, what to say, to call them, to write them, all of the ways that you can get in contact. And it's important that we make our voices heard, because while we think maybe we're just one person, what's it really going to matter? I guarantee you, I know for a fact that people who hate trans people are saying what they think, and they're telling those lawmakers. So it's really, really important that we ensure that lawmakers know that we are supportive of trans people, that we want trans protections and rights, and basic human rights. And then the last thing I would say that any person can do is to interrupt anti-trans narratives when you hear them. So speaking up, when you hear an anti-trans joke, when somebody makes a comment that's off base, when someone uses a stereotype or shares some sort of myth or misconception, it's really important, even if you don't have the right answers, to say, hey, wait a second, I don't think that's right. Like, we're making big generalizations here. We're talking about people, and getting people to interrupt those narratives from, whether it's responding to an article online, or even just having a conversation with your friends or your coworkers at the water cooler or virtual water cooler these days, right? Like those, remember your area of influence. You don't have to be a Nike sponsored athlete or a person on social with a blue check to make a difference or to have a platform. Each of us has a circle of influence, and that might be your team at work, your roommates at college, depending on where you're at. You all have people that you interact with, family and friends, and your opinion means a lot to them. So make sure that you are sharing your support of the trans community.
Yeah, I think that's so important that you highlighted that. Like, I feel like a lot of times when I, talk to people, they feel, oh, well, my voice doesn't make a difference. My voice doesn't matter, whatever. And that's so important. Like, even if you're just influencing one person, that person, will absorb that knowledge, hopefully learn from it, and then pass that on themselves, and humanizing. This is a human rights issue, it's human lives are at stake. It's a human rights issue. And local elections, I mean, I ran in one, don't even get me started. Like, they're so crucial, and not just on the state level, but in your municipality, because a lot of those people who are elected or run there will go on to state positions. So make sure you're really checking locally. And I oftentimes get frustrated because a lot of people don't even know who their state representatives are locally. So it's really important to kind of do that due diligence and find out what is their track record. And you mentioned your website, transathlete.com, which sounds amazing, with all these incredible resources on how to contact legislators, and tell us a little bit more about the kind of work you're doing on your website to help trans athletes and to build awareness around that.
Yeah, it really started in 2013, reflecting on my own experience of trying to come out in sports and just how difficult that process was to navigate, how people that I was talking to had no idea what a policy was or should be, how I had to tell them what I needed. And I wasn't even really sure at the time what I needed because I was just going through it myself. And when I look back at how difficult and painful that process was, I decided I didn't want any other athlete to have to experience that. So transathlete.com is a place where I collect policies that are out there. Folks can see what they are. They can use them to compare to other policies. They can use them to help write their own policies. And it's also an educational hub for athletes, coaches, administrators at various levels of play to get information about what it means to be included and what good trans inclusion policies look like. So in the past several years, I've been able to use this as a way to advocate for change by comparing policies, by introducing leagues that don't have policies to them. And also, it's really morphed in the last 3 years since we saw that rise of the anti-trans legislation to be that space where folks can take action. Again, it's just so overwhelming. And with 18 states currently are banning trans kids from participating. Just in the last 3 years, we've had laws pass in 18 different states. And some of them are K through 12, and some of them include college student athletes as well. And so with this rapidly changing sort of landscape of sports, I want people to know what their options are, and also to have a resource hub of how to take action against the discriminatory action that's out there.
That's so great. Yeah, I feel like a lot of times people are overwhelmed with, oh, there's so much information. So to have it all kind of in one space is amazing. So anybody watching, please go to transathlete.com so you can just have it. It's right there, which is awesome. We're wrapping up, but I want to we have some audience questions that just came in. Okay, so Corey asks, when people say hateful things towards trans people, and when they're spewing their garbage, Corey says that they walk away. Do you think by denying hateful people an audience, that sends a message to them as much as verbally opposing walking away quietly?
Yeah, I think there's a time and a place for that. And there's a time and a place that I'm willing to engage. But I think what people fail to remember is that not every trans person is an activist, right? Just because we're trans or we're queer doesn't mean that we want to be like full-time, like we're not. I was just waiting for the moment to use this.
Oh my God, I love that.
It's like, not every trans person wants to be the person to educate everybody in every situation. Like some days I just want to go have lunch. Some days I just want to do my workout. I just want to be a person without having to explain myself to you. So there are absolutely times where I deny people that opportunity to get an audience to engage, to tell me their hateful things. For myself, because I've put myself in this position to be a full-time educator and activist, like I think the best thing I can do every day is wake up and live an awesome life to show people, like being trans is amazing. I love being trans. I love being queer. And people need to see that from me. But that's not everybody's journey. That's not everybody's path. So don't ever feel that you have to engage with people who oppose your identity or who you are. That we don't owe anybody that time of day to let them talk to us in a way that feels dismissive, that feels hateful, that feels hurtful. But on the other hand, if there are moments where you feel like engaging, you can lean into that and ask people why they think what they think and have that conversation, because I do think conversations help to move people, but there are certainly people who are unwilling to be moved. And whether it's online in hateful comments or in real life, less often in real life because there's face-to-face consequences of it. But in both situations, if somebody's just trying to push your buttons, you don't owe them the time of day. Like, you're not going to move that person by sharing your experience. So save your energy for another space and for yourself.
Oh, that is, I can't tell you, like, there are so many times where I'm just like, you know what? This person I do not need, like, my energy is so precious.
Yes.
And you don't need it. And that's also a form of self-care also, right? Like engaging in some of this stuff, especially for when we know often, I feel oftentimes, well, obviously, like, yes, online people just say whatever they want because there's not real life consequences or whatever. And in person, it's a little different. But a lot of times I feel like when people in person really want to, like, get into it with you about it, they're just looking to get a rise out of you. They're not looking to have a constructive dialogue where you can find a middle ground or hear each other out. They just want to get a rise out of you. And those are the instances where I'm just like, you know what? This is not the moment.
No, this is not it.
I'm not going to have the rest of my day ruined because of your bigotry. I just have to, conserve my peace, right?
Yeah.
I think that's so important. We do have to wrap up. They're telling us in the chat to wrap it up. I just want to say, Chris, thank you so much. This is such an important conversation, especially right now. We're in a midterm election year. We have all these pieces of legislation, particularly targeting kids. I'm going to Texas next week for a gig, and I can't wait to, say how I feel in Texas.
The last thing I'll say as we wrap, thank you so much, Marty. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm a big fan of yours. And so this was an amazing session. The last thing that you said was about debate, right? People want to debate us. And I'll just say, no one, my identity should not be up for debate. I am who I am, and you are who you say you are. And so, I would say push back against any of the things that you see in the media that try to frame this as a debate. Because oftentimes those media pieces are just propaganda for people who hate us. And so, it's really important, as you mentioned, self-care in this time and taking action where we can. So use my website, transathlete.com. Follow me online at the Chris Mosier. I share a lot of tips there on how to be an ally, how to take action in different spaces, and just educational stuff that you can share with people to help them understand the trans community a little bit more. I'm really grateful that we had the time here today to share this and to be in conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And now they're telling me in the chat, oh my gosh, I feel like a newscaster. All right. They said the next speaker's not here yet. So we can take one more audience question, which I do believe we have one. Let me scroll up here. Okay. How do we bust the myth that trans athletes have an unfair advantage in sports?
Oof, I can definitely fill time on this one. So buckle up, next speaker. You're going to be waiting a minute. So I think this is an amazing question, because this is really the point that people want to debate, right? Is this idea that trans athletes have an unfair advantage. Interestingly enough, last year, the International Olympic Committee changed their policy that I helped get changed to a framework that allows international federations and national governing bodies, so different sport organizations in different sports, to make their own policies on transgender athletes, with the idea that no athlete has an inherent advantage simply because of who they are. So this is in the Olympic policy. The Olympic framework says no athlete has an advantage because of who they are. People want to point to this idea that every person assigned male at birth is bigger, faster, stronger, and a better athlete than anyone assigned female at birth. This is largely the part of why I think my story hasn't been covered in the same way, is because I defy that narrative, right? So I am absolutely in the face of, as somebody assigned female at birth, winning races against men doesn't make sense to what they want to say in terms of who has an advantage and who doesn't. So one, know that there have been policies in place at sports at various levels of play at the Olympics for nearly 2 decades. And in that time, from 2003 all the way up to 2018, there were over 54,000 people who became Olympians, and 0 of them were trans. Last year in Tokyo, we had our first transgender Olympian, and she was knocked out of competition in the first round. She did not medal. There has not been a wave of transgender athletes taking over sports, of dominating sports. And the same narrative that we heard in the 1970s around Renee Richards, that allowing a trans woman in sports will be the end of women's sports, hasn't happened, right? So we've seen a couple of trans athletes, a handful of us have success. And the truth of the matter is that we participate in sports at a much lower rate than even our queer peers, but far, far lower than our cisgender peers. And that there has been no takeover in sports from trans people. So all of these things that we're reading about, bone density and muscle size and lung capacity, and the sort of pseudoscience that people lean on by comparing inaccurate studies and applying them to trans people, really just hasn't manifested. Mm-hmm. All of these state legislatures are introducing rules and bills based on stereotypes and based on myths. And it's really important that whoever you are, that you pick apart some of those stereotypes and myths, so that you can really make sure that you're sharing accurate information.
Yeah, it's all just fear mongering. It's the same, when they're like, oh, equal marriage is going to happen, the sky is going to fall. Oh, queer people can adopt and have children, the sky is going to fall. Oh, trans athletes, the sky is falling. Like nothing. Everything's fine. It's all just fear tactics. I've never heard so much about sports in my life until this all started happening.
Yeah. If I can, like, just the people who are introducing this legislation, they don't care about women's sports. If people really cared about protecting or saving or enhancing women's sports, they would be focusing on the lack of equal pay, the lack of professional opportunities.
I was just going to say that if you really care.
The lack of Title IX compliance at colleges and universities across the country. They'd be focusing on the high rates of sexual assault and harassment that happen with tremendous cover-ups in our national governing bodies. People aren't focusing any of that. They're not funneling resources into women's sports. And these lawmakers couldn't name an athlete in women's sports. They don't have a jersey. They don't buy tickets. They don't watch the games. So to frame this up as they're trying to protect or save women's sports is laughable at best, because really, there are many issues that are happening with women in sports, and having a transgender teammate is not one of them.
That's absolutely. Well, listen, thank you so much. You're incredible. I want everybody to go to transathlete.com, check out the great work that Chris is doing, and just get active. I always like to bring it back to they're like these young kids who are seeing themselves vilified, and they just want to exist. They simply just want to exist, so thank you for being a role model for folks, and I'm just super grateful for this conversation, especially during Pride Month, because we would not have Pride or any queer rights at all if it wasn't for our trans community. So boom.
Yes, well said.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Clack, clack, y'all. Oh my God.
Mine's in the other room. I wish I had mine with me.
I know, mine's also in the other room. Okay, we're gonna kiki in the other room, y'all. Thank you both so much. Chris and Marty, you're both so inspiring. And I thank you for going a little extra longer with us, for taking the time, and happy Pride. Thank you for everything.